Hello everyone, and welcome back. In this section, we're going to go through an entire data analysis project together using Excel. We're going to walk through the entire process step by step, starting out with the data cleaning process, all the way through to analysing and visualising the data, as well as putting it all together into a final dashboard where we'll be able to click on various elements and filter our data. This is going to be a great learning opportunity where we'll get to apply the skills that we've learned over the past 5 sections in Excel, as well as a good example project that you can show off to recruiters and employers too. Let's move on over into Excel and begin working on our project. Okay. So here I am now inside of Excel, and this is the dataset that we'll be working with for this example. It contains information on different workers at a fictional company, and for our example, we'll be performing something called HR analytics. HR analytics, which is short for Human Resources Analytics, is the process of collecting, analysing, and interpreting data related to human resource functions and processes. Its goal is to utilise data to make more informed decisions about managing employees and optimising HR function. This dataset can be found within the folder for this section, as we can see here. There's 2 files within this folder. The starter file, which contains the raw data, along with the final file, which is the workbook that also contains the completed analysis. And also, in case you overwrite the raw starter file, there's also another copy of this data within the datasets folder too. Before we get stuck into this data, I'll quickly show you what the final dashboard and results of our analysis look like. An important step before we actually clean the data is to make sure that we know and understand what questions we actually need to answer, as this will determine what data cleaning steps we have to take in order to get our data to a point where it's suitable for our analysis. Okay, and this here is our final dashboard. We're going to be creating a couple of different visualizations. To create these, we'll be primarily using PivotTables and PivotCharts. Throughout this section, we'll look at quite a few different aspects of this data, but the main focus of our analysis and the dashboard is going to be on looking at things such as staff attrition, what we can do to improve the performance of staff, both in terms of their performance rating, but also how much money they bring in for the business. And we'll also identify if there's any areas that may require new employees in the coming years due to factors such as staff retirement. Now that we've had a quick look at the dashboard, let's begin by discussing our dataset and what each column is. I'll just go ahead and delete this worksheet, as we'll be making it again later on anyway. Okay, so before we do anything, the first thing that I'd always recommend you do is go ahead and actually create a copy of the data. This way, if we make a mistake, we can just go back to the original sheet and know that we've got the raw, unedited data. So I'll just right click on this worksheet and then I'll click on Move or Copy. And then I'll create a copy and I'll stick it over here at the end of the workbook. Now we have a worksheet for our raw data, which I'll rename here, and then a new worksheet where we can work without needing to worry about messing up the data, as we've got a copy of it in another worksheet. And as well as this, I'd also recommend making a backup or copy of the raw file itself too. The next thing that I'd always recommend is, if you're working with a CSV file, like we have here, is to actually resave it to an Excel workbook format, as this way we can be sure that we have access to all of the features, functions and tools that are available in Excel. So I'll go ahead and do that now. So these are the main two things that I would always recommend you do before starting on any data cleaning at all, which were to make sure that you've got copies of the raw data, as well as saving it and working in a proper Excel workbook format. And let's now go ahead and have a look at the dataset. There's quite a few columns here, so I'll go through and explain what some of these are. Our first column here on the age is pretty self-explanatory, but then the attrition column will be a very important one for our analysis. And basically, the attrition column is just telling us if that person has left the company. And this could be through any means at all, such as resignation, termination, death, or retirement. And then the rest of these columns are all pretty straightforward. We will replace these numbers in our categorical columns here. So the education level, environment satisfaction, job level, and so on, with actual descriptive labels instead of just numbers. And then also another two important columns that we have here are the monthly income and the monthly rate. The monthly income is the salary that the employee earns. So as part of our data cleaning process, we'll rename this to make it a bit easier to understand. And then the monthly rate is just the revenue that the employee is estimated to bring in each month for the company. These two columns are going to be very important for our analysis, and we'll actually use these to create a return on investment column during our data cleaning and preparation phase. And then all of these final columns here just provide some information on that particular employee. And then each row here just contains information for a particular employee. There are a total of 1,470 employees in this dataset, which is by far the largest dataset that we've looked at so far. Now that we've gone over our dataset and have familiarized ourselves with the columns and data inside of it, let's go ahead and start cleaning the data, which is probably the single most important part of the entire data analysis process, as making sure that your data quality is good is crucial to making sure that your results are accurate. But as we mentioned before, the steps that you take here will largely be determined by the questions that you need to answer. We know from before, when we looked at our dashboard, that for this project, we want to mainly focus on looking at information on employee attrition and the factors that contribute to employee performance, as well as looking at the salaries for each of our employees. With that said, one of the first steps that we'll usually take is to check for any duplicate values inside of our data. We had a look at how to do this in our section on data tools in Excel, so I'll just go ahead and select any cell from within our entire data set, and then on the Data tab, I'll hit on Remove Duplicates, which will open the Remove Duplicates wizard. Our data does have headers, so I'll make sure to leave this option checked, as well as making sure that all of our columns are selected, and then I'll go ahead and hit OK. In this case, there weren't any duplicate values in the data, but it's always worthwhile doing this just to make sure that there aren't any duplicate values in your data, as these can have a negative impact on the results and accuracy of your analysis. The next thing to do is to check for and deal with any missing values in our data. Missing data usually comes in the form of either a completely blank or missing value, or a placeholder value such as -1 or 999, for example. But typically, if there's a placeholder value involved, such as we just mentioned, then this will usually be documented from wherever you received the dataset. Inside of Excel, there are two main ways to check for blank and missing data. The first of which is through the filter menu, and then the second is by using the Find Special tool. I'll start by showing you how to do this with the filter menu. I'll enable filter with Control plus Shift plus L, like we looked at before, and then if we click on the drop-down arrow for our column, we'll get a list of all of the possible values in that column, which we can see here for our age column. The youngest person was 18, and then the oldest person was 60. And then if I delete the value from one of these cells, and then go ahead and check this column again, we can see that at the bottom, we have an option for blanks, which shows us that there is some missing data in this column. But if you've got a data set with quite a few different columns, then doing it this way can take quite a while. So I'll now show you another way of checking for missing values, which is the Find Special tool. And this just allows us to search for specific types of cells within a data set. To better demonstrate how this works, I'll go ahead and actually delete the contents of another cell too. The Find Special tool can be found on the Home tab under Find and Select. If we click into this, there's quite a few different options, but the one that we're interested in is blanks. Let's select this and click OK, and then Excel will select all of these cells in our worksheet that are blank. And then if you did have any blank or missing data, you'd have to either fill it with another value, such as the average of that column, which we could do with the average function, or alternatively, we could just drop the row. I'll add the data back in for these two cells, and then if we run this again, we'll see that there's no blank cells in our data set. So in this case, this isn't something that we'll need to deal with. The final thing that we usually check for is that all of our data is in the correct format. A good example of this would be if we had a date column. We would need to find out what format it should be in for our data set. So either UK date time or US date time, for instance, and then make sure that every date is in that format. Another thing to check here is that all of our data is actually accurate and relevant. And we'll actually see a good example of this when we have a look at the standard hours worked for each of our employees a little later on. But in this case, most of our other data looks okay. And these are typically all of the generic and universal steps that you'd take with any new dataset just to make sure that it's in a good state for analysing. And just to recap these, we checked for duplicates, as well as any missing data, and also that all of our data is in the correct format and that it's accurate and relevant. And this then brings us on to the next part of the process, which is more specific to the dataset that you're working on, and that is to get rid of any unnecessary and redundant columns. A lot of times, you'll receive a dataset and need to answer a particular question, but the dataset itself may contain a lot of other columns that aren't needed to answer that particular question. Before starting our analysis, we should actually remove these columns, not only to improve the performance by removing unnecessary data, but also to make things easier for us to read by reducing some of what would otherwise be visual clutter. For this project, we were looking at answering questions relating to employee attrition, as well as factors that affect employee performance and how much money they bring in for the company. In that case, there's quite a lot of columns here that we could actually get rid of. As I've already been through and actually done the project and created the final dashboard for this project, like I showed you earlier, I already know what columns we'll need for our analysis. But this, of course, will change from project to project. So it'll come down to your personal judgment and discretion as to what columns you need. But the benefit of keeping a copy of the raw data is that if we ever need to copy that column or data back in, we can do so very easily. In this case, I'm going to go through and delete the business travel, daily rate, employee count, hourly rate, job involvement, number of companies worked, over 18, overtime, relationship satisfaction, stock option, total working years, years in current role, years since last promotion, and finally the years with current manager columns. There's so many different possible questions that we could have answered with these columns, but we're just going to really focus in on the specific questions that we mentioned earlier. Okay, so next up, I'd just like to go through and rename some of these columns to make them a little more descriptive, as well as the fact that these headings will of course affect the axis labels on our graphs too. So it's important that they're easy for other stakeholders and staff to understand. We'll leave attrition as it is, but I will change the monthly income to be employee salary and then the monthly rate to be employee revenue. The official term for this is revenue per employee, but as well as being descriptive, it's also important that our headings are concise, as long column headings often take up too much space on charts, as well as being harder to read at a glance. Perfect. So all we need to do now is go through and add in a couple of new columns, as well as replacing some of the numerical values in our categorical columns with more descriptive labels. We'll start by adding in the new columns, which is a part of what's called the feature engineering process. And feature engineering is typically referred to in the context of machine learning and data science. However, its principles and steps can also be of benefit for our data analysis work too. Feature engineering is essentially just the process of transforming raw data into more meaningful and informative features that help us to better understand the data, as well as improving our analysis. And we can do this just by manipulating and creating new features from the existing data. Some good examples of this to show you would be to create some new categorical columns for the age column, as well as creating a ROI, or return on investment column, that will tell us whether or not that employee is actually bringing in more money than they're costing. So in other words, are they a good return on investment? And we'll start by having a look at our age column. Typically, when we plot ages, you would use some kind of age group or categorical column, such as is the age over 55, for example, with a simple true and false or yes or no value, for instance. And the reason for this is that currently our age column has got a lot of different values going from 18 all the way up to 60. If we were to plot this, there'd be way too much information and our charts would get really messy and hard to interpret, as you can see from this example here. And this is an actual example using the data as it is from this data set, by the way. Thankfully, pivot tables in Excel provide us with the ability to group data, so we don't need to worry about creating any age groups. What we will do though is create two new categorical columns for two very specific age groups. We'll have one column for if they're 25 years old or younger, and the other for 55 years old or older. And this will help us to have a look at any of our really young junior employees to see if we have any promising young talent, as well as any employees that might be nearing retirement age, so we can plan ahead for any possible future attrition. What we'll do is come up here to the top and I'll right click to insert a new column. And we'll give this column a heading of age less than or equal to 25. for the values, we could just use a simple Boolean condition of is this cell less than or equal to 25? But that would just return a simple Boolean value of true or false, which I don't want. Instead, I'd like a yes or no answer, as it'll look a little nicer on our plots. To do this, we can use an if statement. We'll say if, and then our test will be if the cell is less than or equal to 25. If it is, the value will be yes, and if it's false, then we'll say no. Okay, perfect. And then we'll check this is working for the rest of our cells by double-clicking on the autofill handle down here to fill it for the rest of our rows. And then I will use the filter menu just to make sure that we don't have any blank or NA values in this column. Okay, and then let's go through and do the same, but for our other column of is age greater than or equal to 55, which will be the exact same process that we just did. But for our test, this will just be if the age or this cell is greater than or equal to 55, and then our two values for if true and if false will just be yes and no. Okay, so we've now got these two categorical columns here for our age of 25 or under and 55 or older. These different groups will be much more usable than the individual ages that we have currently in our ages column. So we'll definitely be using these when we come to analyze and visualize our data. And as well as this, we'll also go through and group our individual ages into bins too, but by using pivot tables. We'll also now add in a new column for the ROI2, which will calculate the return on investment the company makes from each employee in terms of what the company pays out to them as a salary and the revenue that the employee brings in. The formula for ROI is just the revenue minus the cost, or in this case the salary, divided again by the cost. I'll go ahead and create a new column here off to the right of our employee revenue, which I'll just call ROI. And then applying this formula to our dataset, we'll have the employee revenue minus the employee salary, and then this divided by the employee salary. And just note here, I've got the subtraction in brackets so that the order of operations is correct. And then let's autofill this down for the rest of our rows, and then format the entire column as a percentage. Okay, so now that we've got all of our new columns made, we'll go through and replace the numbers in our categorical columns with actual descriptive labels. For instance, in our education column, instead of numbers ranging from 1 to 5, it would be better to have this actually start with, let's say, high school, and then go to undergraduate, and so on. To do this, we can use the Find and Replace tool. We just want to replace values in this column, so I'll select the entire column by clicking on its column letter, and then going up to the Find and Select button on our Home tab and clicking on Replace. Alternatively, we could have used the shortcut, which is Ctrl+H. We'll have the different levels of education as high school, undergraduate, postgraduate, professional certification, and other, in the order of 1 to 5 respectively. Let's replace 1 with high school, and then click on Replace All Occurrences. And then we'll do the same for 2, but this time we'll replace it with undergraduate. And then I'm just going to go ahead and fast forward while I repeat this step for 3, 4, and 5 with postgraduate, professional certification, and other. Okay, and there we go. The main reason for doing this is that when we come to plot our chart, having actual descriptive labels will make it much easier to interpret, as otherwise we just have numbers going from 1 to 5, which by themselves don't really mean too much. Within this dataset, there's a few more columns that we'll need to go through and repeat this process for, which are the environment satisfaction, job level, and job satisfaction, as well as our standard hours column. Currently, our standard hours in this dataset for each employee is 80. There'll be a lot of times where you'll be given data without any way of knowing if it's actually accurate or not. But in a lot of cases, you'll be able to apply a little bit of your own personal knowledge and take an estimated guess as to if it's actually correct or not. In this case, we know that an 80-hour working week is way above the average, which sits at more or less around 40 hours per week. So we could safely assume here that there's been a mistake and this value has somehow been multiplied by 2. So we'll go ahead and replace all these values with 40. In a real life situation, we should of course verify this, but it's a good example just to show you how even though the data may look like it's correct and it's in the correct format, if you take a step back and look at it as a bigger picture, taking other facts and context into account, you might find that the values don't actually stack up. But this is a skill that you'll pick up as you go along. Starting with our environment satisfaction, these categories will be dissatisfied, neutral, satisfied, and very satisfied. So I'll just go through and repeat the same process as before and replace all of these numbers with labels, like so. And I'll just fast forward while I do the rest of these. And then job level has 5 values, which will go from entry level right through all the way up to executive. So we'll have 1 starting at entry level, 2 will be junior, 3 will be mid-level, 4 senior, and finally we'll have number 5 as executive. And then for our job satisfaction, I'll just fast forward while I add these in, as these have the same categories as our environment satisfaction. And then finally, I'll select our standard hours column and set and replace all of these values with 40. Okay, so great job there everyone. With that done, we pretty much got our data into a good, clean state. So we'll be ready to start analysing and visualising this data in the next lecture. There wasn't too much to clean in this example, but it did provide us the opportunity to demonstrate and go over a lot of the common types of data cleaning tasks that you're likely to need to carry out. So, as I mentioned, in the next lecture, we'll actually move on to analysing this data, the majority of which we'll do with a mix of pivot tables and pivot charts, as these will be the most common tools that you'll be using in any real-life projects. So it's going to be really good to get some more practice using these tools. I hope the steps and thought process behind the data cleaning here has made sense, as well, of course, as how we actually carried out these cleaning tasks. So if you've got any questions, then please post them down in the Q&A section below, and I'll of course get back to you. This has been quite a long lecture, so let's wrap it up here for now, and then move on to the analysis in our next lecture. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you all there.